Good evening, everyone. I'm glad to see everyone here. I'd like to basically make this a little bit general, but I wanted to pertain to a particular item that's coming up, and I won't say what. My name is Willie Phillips, and for those of you who may not know me, I've been in this community for South Berkeley. I was born here, and I've been here for 64 years. But I wanted to really reflect, the very fact is that if you look at the change that's going on in this particular community, it's dire in the sense that it represents a change in terms of order, a change of essentially people that have been here for many years leaving. And it's an issue that I think reflects the very fact is that gentrification is right here in Berkeley. Not in Boston, not in New York, not in Rhode Island, nor Mississippi. But it's an issue that reflects the very fact is that being able to look at the equity of that and being able to come up with policies that reflect Berkeley as a whole. Berkeley has a reputation, and it's a question of leadership and direction. How many people think that people of color count in this process? How many people actually believe that people that were here before them actually make a difference in terms of the culture, the overall landscape of this particular society? And it's not about money. Because the very fact is that if we leave that equation alone, we can come up with solutions that are creative, that are equitable for all members of this particular community. But that's all I have to say about that.
Berkeley Community Garden Collaborative. We work through the whole process of getting the zoning correct so that future gardeners can step into the process and know how and where and what to do to make it successful. I have shared with you the brochure for the collaborative and also a project that I'm doing with Cal Berkeley. I'm working with Sarah Maxson over in the Santa Fe right-of-way in South Berkeley, which we would like to see become a greenway with a youth training garden in place. And so when the RFP for this project comes through, and you see it, remember me. And remember what Willie Phillips said, because we're talking the same community and support our endeavor. Thank you so much.
Will it be posted online? Okay, great. Thank you. Anybody else want to speak on something not on the agenda for tonight?
I will. Yeah, I gotta find what I'm gonna say. I did not wing it. Okay. Keep it short and sweet. I just want to give a comment about the homelessness problem in Berkeley, and so I'd like to talk briefly about the filthy sanitation that exists in our homeless population. It is unacceptable that we leave people out in the streets to live like wild animals, with no bathrooms, no washrooms, no food storage, and no way to remove the garbage that accumulates. We, as a community, can do better than this. We can come up with some basic needs of our homeless people, and we can address those needs without spending a lot of money. It only takes compassion and the ability to think outside the box to create solutions that can help people to live better lives while waiting for housing to be created. I'd like to see the City Council have a meeting of problem solvers to address these specific concerns and to make the necessary changes. Let's get together and fix this mess. Thank you. Thank you. I'm Taj Payne, Friends of Adeline, NAACP, and the Homeless Force Coalition founder. How you doing? Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right, anybody else, wish to speak on something not on the agenda? Okay, thank you. We will move on to the planning staff report.
So first, if you need a chair, there's a room next door where you can go and grab an extra chair. Sorry, we didn't go in. Second, I just wanted to point out that we only have the senior center until 10 p.m. tonight. So our meeting is from 7 to 10, so I just want to make sure everybody's cognizant of how much time we have. And then the only thing that I really wanted to report on is that there are two information items in your packet, and I wanted to explain why they're in there. So the first information item is a ZAB report on 2025 Grant Avenue, 2020 Bancroft. And so at our last meeting, we talked about parking reform, and a week after we had that meeting, ZAB heard this or discussed this permit, and I thought that it was interesting because ground floor parking was converted into 26 spaces were converted into 2 units, and so I thought it was relevant to our conversation last meeting, and I just wanted to take a look at it. And then Chris is going to speak on the reason why the other items in there. That's it.
Great, that's all for the staff report. Then chairperson's report, as I said, there's a second information item in the packet. That is the African American Holistic Resource Center feasibility study. And first I want to acknowledge that there's many people in the crowd here tonight who were deeply involved in putting this feasibility study together, so thank you for all of your time and effort. And so included it as an information item and for the agenda tonight specifically because of a lot of the research and engagement that went into creating this, the health disparity data, the survey data, the kind of analysis of why is a resource center like this so important for South Berkeley and for the African American community of Berkeley. I thought was really important and compelling context as we think about the conversation tonight and the conversation that we will have in the coming months here on the Planning Commission related to the Adeline Corridor Plan and pressures of displacement and the housing crisis in Berkeley. So really encourage everybody on the commission and everyone in the audience to look at that, read that, and really think about and reflect on, particularly I think those survey responses were just so compelling. So again, thank you everyone, many people here tonight who worked on that, and I look forward to seeing that project progress. That is all that I have for the chairperson's report, and so we will move to committee reports. I don't believe we have not had any committee meetings. Do we have any coming up?
Well, tonight we're looking to create.
Well, yes.
Yeah, but.
Okay. Then let's go to, so then there's no reports on any committee meetings because there were didn't for our last planning commission meeting. So we'll move to item number 7, approval of the minutes. So anybody have any comments about the minutes? I have one. Rob? Rob Kappa or?
Brad.
Oh, sorry. Okay, Brad, we'll start with you. And then we'll move on.
Remember Andy's software.
Go ahead, Brad.
So, it looks like the math is right. We had 9 votes in favor on item 9, item 11, and item 12. And I don't want to make it stop me, but there's only 8 people listening, so I'm just reminding that in here so that the 9 votes will reflect the newest member falling in line with the rest of the planning.
Oh, in all of them.
Big catch.
No, wait. Not on item 7, but on item 9.
Yeah, 9, 11, and 12.
9, 11, and 12.
Just that addition.
Yeah. Thank you, Brad.
That's all I look for when I read these.
Okay, and then Rob.
And currently I look for Jeff's name, because line 81, it should be Jeff's last name, and his first name is, and then I think item 9 is actually, was to elect, not to nominate, that was last year. So both 98 and 99.
All right. note those corrections?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, can I get a motion?
Motion approved.
Jeff moves.
Second.
Brad seconds. All in favor? Aye. Any abstentions? One abstention. All right, thank you. Item number 8, future agenda items and other planning related events.
So we have 3 public hearings at the April 3rd meeting. We're planning to have 3 public hearings. So
Wow.
one is gonna be on the affordable housing mitigation fee referral. That you're reading the subcommittee, that you may elect a subcommittee to discuss in this meeting. Second one is Southside Parkway overlay zoning ordinance amendments. And the third one is gonna be comprehensive cannabis, amendments. And then the fourth item is gonna be electing a subcommittee for the zoning ordinance revision project, ZORP. So you had a subcommittee that was over a year ago, and so you need to re-elect.
Is it an elected or an appointed?
You need to appoint 3 members.
And there's been some turnover, I believe, for Tasha the member, so, okay. Great. Yeah.
So, Adeline, on the mitigation, the subcommittee, that's item 12 on the agenda here. And so is it correct that for anyone who's here to speak about item 12, that the public hearing for item 12 is gonna be April 3rd?
Yes, tonight is just a formation of a subcommittee, and then within the next 2 weeks, we expect the subcommittee to convene, and that will be a public meeting where anyone can come and comment and discuss the referral itself. Tonight is just the formation of the subcommittee.
Okay, thank you so much for that clarification, so just for everybody here, so they know, if you're here for item 12, the public comment on it is not tonight.
Public will be on the formation of the subcommittee.
On the formation of the subcommittee, not the actual, referral.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Does then the subcommittee have to do substantive work prior to the April 3rd meeting for what we're gonna action on that night?
Can we hold that comment till item 12?
Sure.
Because I think that'll be a longer discussion about what the role of the subcommittee will be,
Okay.
but, thank you. Okay, I wanna note, there's some folks in the back, it looks like there's some empty chairs towards the front here. Willie, I think your jacket is taking a few of them, but there's,
Oh, that's a placeholder.
if people want a seat, there are open seats.
I don't want to be displaced.
Too late.
On that, we are gonna go to the next item, which is actually going to be what is called on the printed agenda here, item 10, the local community preference for affordable housing case study.
I'm just gonna frame the items before the presenter comes to speak. So, let me just get this. So, good evening, commissioners. Good evening, everyone. My name is Elisa Shen. I'm a principal planner with the planning department of the city of Berkeley. I'm here tonight just to briefly frame agenda items 9 through 11. And what you're going to hear right now are 2 presentations. They relate to key issues of concern that have been brought up during the Adeline corridor planning process, as well as related to citywide policy efforts as well. And so the first presentation is going to be from Eli Kaplan. He's a UC Berkeley graduate student who is doing his master's project on studying local community preference policies in different cities. And he's going to talk about that. And our second presentation will be from Rick Jacobus with Street Level Advisors, who's a member of our consultant team to prepare the plan. And Rick will be previewing concepts about affordable housing and community benefits that will be addressed in the plan. And the reason that we're coming to you now, before the draft plan is out with these presentations, is because we think that it's going to be very helpful to have as background the housing economics and the legal framework underpinning concepts when you do review the plan. So I just want to emphasize again that there are going to be many opportunities to actually comment on the plan after the plan is out in late April, early May, and also discuss and ask further questions from city staff and our technical experts. And my understanding is after each presentation, there'll be time for questions and public comment. And after you hear those presentations, as the agenda has been rearranged, I'll come back to you with a little information about the remainder of the planning process and come back with the request to form a subcommittee for the Adeline corridor specific plan and also be able to answer questions then. So with that, I will turn it over to Eli.
And for folks sitting in the audience, if you want to be able to move up here, it might be hard to see this from the back. The PowerPoint will also be available online afterwards. And do we have any copies of this for people to look at if they can't see it?
No, we don't.
We do not have
We'll
any.
have it online after the meeting.
Okay, we do not have any copies available, but this will be available online on the Planning Commission webpage.
Yeah, if they just hold the table back. Is there any way the table can slide to make it just get bigger?
Cool. Alright, good to go, everyone.
It's another way to say
As Elisa mentioned, I'm Eli, and I'm in the Metro City Planning Program at UC Berkeley in my last semester. And for my capstone project, I've been working with planning and also with health, housing, and community services on researching how the city of Berkeley could implement a community preference policy for affordable housing. And part of that research is case studies of existing policies, and I'm here to present some initial findings. So, to start, what are community preference policies? Generally speaking, affordable housing units in the United States are available to all who qualify based on income guidelines. However, local governments throughout the country have implemented preference policies, and specifically what I'm calling community preference policies are those that prioritize applicants who have some connection to the location where the unit is located. And it's important to clarify a distinction between community preference policies and what might be called right of return policies. Community preference policies that prioritize people who have been displaced are sometimes referred to in popular discourse as right of return, but right of return itself exists in a very specific context, usually in terms of public housing redevelopment, like Hope SF, where you have public housing projects that are being redeveloped and current residents are relocated during the redevelopment and then are guaranteed a unit in the new redeveloped public housing development. However, what we're talking about tonight, community preference policies, and what cities currently have implemented community preference policies do not guarantee a unit for residents who have been displaced, and so cities themselves do not frame these policies as right of return, because that wouldn't be a completely accurate characterization. However, these policies hopefully provide an opportunity to return for displaced residents, as they may give them priority for affordable units. And so why might we need a community preference policy in Berkeley? Some quick context. A community preference policy would complement the existing anti-displacement policy framework in the city. So over the past few decades, as we can see on the screen, the city has implemented a variety of policies that in some way or another serve an anti-displacement purpose. So there's rent stabilization and the tenant protection ordinance that requires just cause for eviction, which helps to keep tenants in place. And then the other policies listed below help preserve the existing supply of rental housing stock. And additionally, the city supports the expansion of the affordable housing supply. The affordable housing mitigation fee results in below market and affordable housing units being included in new market rate projects. And the city also supports affordable housing developers in building new developments through funding with the Housing Trust Fund. But as I'm sure everyone in this audience is aware, we do have ongoing gentrification in the city and decreasing economic and racial diversity, which calls for the need to strengthen the existing anti-displacement tools. And so that's the role a preference policy would serve, is that it would complement the existing anti-displacement framework and would hopefully strengthen it by improving the ability for vulnerable Berkeley residents to access affordable housing in their community. And in addition to this apparent need for policy, the community engagement process during the Adeline corridor community open houses indicated support for a housing preference policy for current or displaced residents in the area. And City Council issued a directive to Health, Housing, and Community Services to research possibilities for preference ordinance. And so that's where I came in, and my role is supporting that research and the recommendations that HHCS will be making. So overall, a finding from my research is there are generally 4 types of community preference policies. Well, what I mean by this more is there's 4 categories of applicants that get preference in different policies. And so the different existing policies might include all 4 of these categories or just one or a mix. And so current city residents may be prioritized, or those who are employed in the city, whether or not they live there. Neighborhood residents, meaning those currently living near the unit they're applying for. And then there are some cities that have displacement-related preferences for current or former residents who have been displaced from a unit under very specific circumstances. And these circumstances include government action like code enforcement or urban renewal, no-fault evictions, or natural disasters. And it's important to note that the Fair Housing Act creates some constraints for these types of policies. In the past, these policies were actually mainly used by white communities in order to preserve exclusion in those communities, and those policies were then invalidated by the courts. And so even though contemporary community preference policies are more likely to have the intent to help low-income residents or communities of color remain in place, they still could be reviewed by HUD and then found not to be in compliance with federal law if it's found that they might perpetuate existing patterns of segregation or if they disproportionately impact a specific racial group. And so cities need to ensure when they're crafting these policies that they really establish the legitimate government interest in prioritizing a specific group. And so I studied existing policies in 5 cities. I selected Cambridge because it has a fairly similar demographic makeup to Berkeley, both in terms of city size and also in terms of being a very expensive city, but that is also fairly racially and socioeconomically diverse. And then Oakland, San Francisco, and Santa Monica has a similar legal and housing context to Berkeley due to shared locations in California. And then Portland's policy is somewhat unique and innovative in ways that it incorporates generational ties, and it's gotten some coverage in the press, so that was an important one to look into. And then lastly, I am doing a little bit of research into some policies that have not yet been implemented but are in development in Austin and Seattle. These cities are also experiencing rapid gentrification and are developing their policies in an explicit anti-displacement framework. So their process to develop these policies and the designs they settle on could be a helpful model for Berkeley. So one of my findings, just generally speaking, these policies have kind of 4 categories of characteristics. As I mentioned previously, they vary in terms of the type of preference they give, the categories of preference, which, as I said, were being a city resident, being employed in the city, being a neighborhood resident near the unit, or being displaced under these very specific circumstances. Also, policies vary in terms of the type of affordable housing that they impact. Generally speaking, cities that implement these policies have 1 or 2 types of affordable housing, what I'll call inclusionary units, which are the below market rate units that for-profit developers include in market rate projects as a result of inclusionary housing policies, and then nonprofit units, which are the units in nonprofit affordable housing developments that receive some type of government subsidy. And so in the cities I looked at, policies might affect the city's inclusionary units, their nonprofit units, or sometimes both. The policies also vary in terms of who's responsible for screening and verifying the preference. Sometimes it's the city, sometimes it's the developer, both affordable and market rate. And then it also differs in terms of how the preference impacts the tenant selection process, and I'll get more into that with each case study. So first in Cambridge, their preference policy is part of their inclusionary housing ordinance, and so it only impacts inclusionary units in market rate projects. And in Cambridge, the city's housing division is responsible for the tenant selection process for inclusionary units. So they're directly implementing the preference policy. And so if someone wants an inclusionary unit or to live in an inclusionary unit in Cambridge, they apply to the city, to this rental applicant pool. And on the application, they note whether they qualify for any of the preferences listed all the way on the left. And depending how many of those you qualify for, you would get a certain number of points. And then those with the most points would be highest on the wait list. So when there's a new market rate project comes online that has inclusionary units, or an existing inclusionary unit is vacant, they notify the city refers to their list of applicants, and then they give the developer potential applicants for those units. And so again, those with the most points will be highest on that list, and thus most likely to get an inclusionary unit. So this policy has not had any fair housing challenges to date. And one of the reasons for that could be that, as I stated, this is only an inclusionary projects or inclusionary units in market rate projects. There wouldn't be any sort of HUD financing involved in this, as there might be in an affordable project. So HUD does not need to review these tenant selection and market plans. And then this policy does seem to be pretty effective in terms of housing Cambridge residents. You can see 90% of new inclusionary tenants last year were current Cambridge residents. And it does seem to be pretty impactful in terms of housing people from diverse socioeconomic and racial backgrounds. The majority of inclusionary tenants in market rate developments in Cambridge have Section 8 vouchers, which are those from low socioeconomic backgrounds. And also the majority of tenants are people of color, while the city is majority non-Hispanic white. In Portland, there's the North-Northeast preference policy, which is very specific in that it is only in a particular part of the city, and it only applies to units developed in this neighborhood. And so it was implemented to address displacement issues in this neighborhood and address some historic wrongs due to urban renewal actions that occurred in this part of the city. So in Portland, and this applies only to the nonprofit unit, so if there's an affordable housing development being built in this particular neighborhood, and if it has city funding, then the tenants for these developments come from a list developed by the city. So if you're interested in obtaining a unit in a development in this neighborhood, you apply to the Portland Housing Bureau, and on your application, you would indicate if you had an address in this neighborhood or if you have an ancestor that had an address in this neighborhood. And for each of those addresses, you could get up to 3 points, more points based on the most urban renewal activity that occurred. And then that would impact, those with more points would be more likely to obtain a unit. And anyone whose property has been seized by the city through urban renewal, if it was you or your family, would go to the top of this waiting list. It's important to note that this policy has only been implemented in 2 developments that have yet to open, so the impact is unknown. And also the impact of this policy is inherently limited because it is only in this small section of the city. The Portland Housing Bureau estimates that based on the development pipeline, it may impact up to 500 units. To date, there haven't been any legal challenges related to fair housing. A few reasons for that could be, even though this policy does intend to correct historic wrongs that mainly affected the city's African American population, the policy itself is race neutral. It does not provide a priority based on race, and anyone who's ever had an address in this neighborhood would qualify for the preference. And so it wouldn't just necessarily be for longtime residents or those who have the generational ties. It's based solely on having an address in the neighborhood. And over the past 20 years, as neighborhood demographics has changed, that would be a variety of folks. So it's not necessarily disproportionately for a specific group. And then also this policy isn't tied, even though it's based on geography, you don't need to be a current resident. So it's HUD potentially looks closer at policies tied to very specific geographies. This would affect people living across the city or the area. So in San Francisco, there's a centralized lottery for all inclusionary and nonprofit units. The city has 4 preference programs that impact the outcomes of those lotteries. And the first is for current or former residents of San Francisco who were displaced by urban renewal activity in the 60s and 70s. The next is for current and former San Francisco residents who've been displaced by no-fault evictions or fires. Then they have a neighborhood resident preference for those living in the same supervisor district or a half-mile from the unit they're applying for. And lastly, there's a general preference for those who live or work in San Francisco. So for all inclusionary units and market rate projects and nonprofit units, the city conducts a lottery. And this is a tiered system, so the preferences I've listed on the left are in order of rank. And so the urban renewal preference, you would have the highest odds in the lottery, followed by the no-fault eviction, and moving forward. So in 2016, there was a HUD challenge to implementing the neighborhood resident preference in the Willie B. Kennedy apartments in the Western Addition. Since this project had HUD financing, they were reviewing the marketing plan and tenant selection process, and they had concerns about the neighborhood resident housing preference. They felt it might perpetuate segregation. And so the city's solution to that was to use a different preference based on living in areas vulnerable to displacement and gentrification. They developed these metrics with researchers at UC Berkeley, and so there were census tracts throughout the city that qualified, and so HUD was okay with that because it wasn't tied to this particular geography. It was vulnerable renters, but those located throughout the city. And then it's notable that in the years since, the Mayor's Office of Housing and Community Development does continue to use this neighborhood resident preference policy in lotteries. It was for this particular project that it was not allowed, but they have not dropped it altogether. It does still exist. In Santa Monica, it's pretty similar to Cambridge, that their preference policy is part of the inclusionary housing program, so it only impacts inclusionary units and market rate projects. It's the same where the city's housing division controls the tenant selection process, so if you're interested in an inclusionary unit in Santa Monica, you apply to the city, and they have 2 preference categories, one for current or former residents who've been displaced by natural disaster, government action like code enforcement or redevelopment agency property seizures, and then no-fault evictions, and a second preference for those living or working in Santa Monica. And this is a tiered system, so the displacement preference, those who have the displacement preference would be highest on the waiting list, followed by the live-work preference, followed by all other applicants. And Santa Monica does not collect data on whether current inclusionary tenants had a preference, so the impact is somewhat hard to say. The wait list there is currently closed. They have far more applicants to this than they do inclusionary units. One piece of data I was able to get from the city is that when the wait list was opened a few years ago, there were 33,000 applicants, and about 10% had a live-work preference, so it's about 3,000 people, and that's far more applicants than there are units. So it is likely that most people in inclusionary units in Santa Monica do qualify for the live-work preference. And in Santa Monica, there has not been a fair housing challenge for this policy. It's, again, like Cambridge, this is only in market rate projects, so that could be part of that. And also prioritizing living and working. For Santa Monica, it's partially a fair housing strategy It's not a particularly diverse city, but the workforce is more diverse than its residents, and so that creates some more balance when having this preference. And lastly, in Oakland, there's a preference policy for nonprofit projects. If a affordable developer is using city funding sources in the regulatory agreement, they agree to implement certain preferences. According to Oakland's ordinance, the preferences are applicants who have been displaced by City of Oakland redevelopment agency projects, being displaced by Oakland's code enforcement, or having a no-fault eviction. There's also a preference for those living in the same neighborhood as development, and then a general live-work preference. And so this preference differs in that all the other ones I went over are implemented directly by the city, and this one is implemented entirely by developers. The city's role is just ensuring this is in the regulatory agreement, and then doing auditing to ensure the preference is being used, but the city really has no role in implementation or verification. So lastly, I looked at policies in development in Austin and Seattle. In Austin, this policy came out of a city council resolution in March 2018. And also the city's anti-displacement task force in their report recommended a preference policy for displaced residents. So far, the city staff has studied policies in 6 cities and met with community stakeholders. And currently, the city attorney is working with the city council. I've been told the city attorney is concerned that the policy furthers fair housing and does not want the policy designed to perpetuate patterns of neighborhood segregation there. And Austin's intent, though they're really still working on the policy, they haven't defined this concept of generational ties, so they're working on that. But their current intent is for the policy to be implemented by nonprofit developers with city staff auditing, similar to Oakland, as that would likely take less city resources. And then in Seattle, this also came out of the city council resolution in July 2017. Just a few weeks ago, the mayor signed an executive order which orders the Office of Housing and Affordable Developers to come up with a policy by the end of April. And the plan is to evaluate the policy on a project-by-project basis to ensure fair housing compliance. And so my next steps, now that I've completed my case studies, I'm going to take a look at what practices from other cities might fit best with a local Berkeley context, and what might be the administration required to implement in terms of staffing, and how the city might define its policy goals for this policy, and then what data would need to be collected in order to measure effectiveness and whether these goals are being achieved. That was kind of an issue I saw in other cities. Cambridge had that data that I presented to you, but that was often lacking in other cities. And then lastly, what constraints might issues like fair housing or staffing limitations pose for such a policy in terms of how it would be implemented. So, thank you.
Thank you. So I recognize we have another presentation, a few more items, and also want to make sure that there's public comment on each of these items. Can I get a sense of how many people want to make public comment related to this item in response to this presentation? If you wouldn't mind just raise your hand. Okay.
Really quick.
That's actually great. Then I'd like to recommend for us as a commission, unless you have clarifying questions about Eli's presentation, that we can hold off on discussion until we've heard both presentations and both rounds of public comment. But if, I think what we'll do now is if there's any clarifying, well, let's do this first. Why don't we take public comment? We'll do 2 minutes each, and then if there's any clarifying questions or comments that the commissioners want to make on this presentation, then we can spend a few minutes on that. Otherwise, we'll go to the next presentation, and then we can have a fuller conversation. Public comment on this item.
I'd like to just make a comment.
Sure. Come up, where's the microphone?
Hi. Should I still say here?
Yeah, there's the microphone. Thank you.
Mr. Kaplan, that was really comprehensive. And I really appreciate it. In the relationship to the Mr. Kaplan at the front table there? So, you know, what I heard initially was opportunity to apply and get back into the community if you had been displaced. The other thing I heard, no guarantees. How much of a gap between that opportunity to apply and get back in and actually getting back in? If there's a big gap, what, and I'm speaking to the panel up here, what recommendations might we make to try to close that gap? That's one. There was also a couple of the cities, I went to Portland just a couple of times in my life. I haven't been to Cambridge, haven't been down to Santa Monica, but I'm familiar with Oakland, I'm familiar with San Francisco. And what I heard was that, you had categories of people that had gotten displaced. Some had been longtime residents, citizens in a geographical area. And then some had been people that worked in the cities. Then I heard you say there's a preference of points that determine who would get selected to come back to the neighborhood. So, relative to the San Francisco, relative to the Oakland, who is on that committee to make those decisions when reviewing the preference points? And, what is the demographic makeup of that little body that makes those important decisions, particularly for people of color that have been displaced? And again, I'm saying this to the city of Berkeley because my assumption is that, you will look at some of these things and kind of come up with a policy of your own, and I'm hoping that you will consider these points.
Can you introduce yourself real quick, and we'll go on.
I'm through, okay, thank you.
What's your name?
I'm Gerald Bartlow. I live up the street on Ashland, and I've been there for 65 years. And I have a real big concern about the numbers of African Americans that have gone down in this area. And I would like to say to the city planning commission or whoever else is going to have an input on the policies that determine who's going to be able to come back in, is that you take that fact into consideration when you come up with a policy. The ultimate determination, whether it's good or bad, will be the impact on people you hope to address and help. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll go through the public comment, and hopefully you're keeping track of these questions, and we can maybe spend a little bit of time you answering them. Great. Next, please come up and please line up with you, and one or two of you who can stand and help us with the out there.
Hi, my name is Dr. Vicki Alexander. I'm a previous health officer for the city and maternal child health director for the city of Berkeley. First, thank you, I forget your name, but Ro, that was a really good presentation.
Yeah.
Very important information was given to us. I just have a couple of comments and questions relevant to the presentation. The first is use of the term affordable is everywhere. Throughout this document, throughout the state stuff, throughout the federal government stuff, and I really question us using affordable as our measure. So I really want us to think about that because we have lots of documentation from the health status report as well as other regional areas reports that the information on just being affordable is too high of an income for what we're needing. And I would actually say that the term affordable is actually
Folks can't hear.
that the term affordable is a smokescreen for insufficient low-cost housing. So we really need to stress it, and we need to really try and flip the script since we are Berkeley. I think that also the particular significance from my organization, which is Healthy Black Families, is that housing is a public health issue, and especially for pregnant women and families with young children. And so I saw nothing in terms of a preference monitoring or looking at particular instances where there is high mortality and stuff like that, and how that would be a preference. So we need to kind of look at that. I will leave it at that, and hopefully others will raise other issues.
Thank you. Nikki, did you
Yes, you can.
Vicki Alexander.
Hello, good evening. I'm Robin Nagusi, Executive Director of Healthy Black Families. So I have a few comments about the presentation and just the concepts that we're discussing at large. So one is that I'm hearing terms such as inclusionary unit, generational ties, these other type of terms. And I think it's really important for us to be mindful of historical implications. It's important for us to be mindful of, because when I think about generational ties, first thing that comes to my mind is the grandfather clause and who inherently gets privilege or advantage over others. So I think we want to be mindful of what that means and how some of these terms may be codified, not intentionally but unintentionally. So I want to point that out first. And as far as anti-displacement policies and the relationship with the right to return or community preference policy, I think just thinking larger about the history of Berkeley, particularly South Berkeley, and the changing demographics over time, what that means for the racial or economic diversity or lack thereof, and as we know, the clear implications of gentrification and what that means. So I want us to be mindful as far as City of Berkeley is concerned, what the values of the city are, what is the vision of the city as far as moving forward, and how policies either exacerbate what we're wanting to avoid, but also thinking about unintentional harm that's embedded in policies because of lack of either a closer look as far as a closer lens at the issues, but be mindful of implications that they may have. As it relates to this matter on local preference policies, and when we talk about the health status report that was released in 2018 in the city of Berkeley, there's huge implications of how housing instability is closely tied to the health inequities that we're seeing in Berkeley. At Healthy Black Families in particular, we service pregnant Black families as well as parenting families. The final point I want to make is we cannot work in silos as whether it's a commission or council, community leaders, but thinking about how the housing instability is going to affect outcomes regarding health, mortality, preterm birth, all these other matters that we're trying to affect. So what we do primarily is really focus on the social determinants of health and the underlying issues, and the common denominator of what we're really addressing is racial inequity, economic inequity, as well as housing instability. It's huge. So I think we want to think about that and make sure that's centered in our discussion around local policy. Thank you.
Hi, thanks again for your presentation. My name is Nikki Mosai, and I'm a physical therapist, and I work downtown with a lot of Medi-Cal patients and Medicare patients, and I've firsthand experienced through them the displacement, loss of housing, and the trauma that they're going through. It's almost impossible to separate that from a physical manifestation. I just wanted to ask about the aspect of work in Berkeley. Now, would that be somebody who's working for the city or somebody who's working at the service sector or like an IT worker that works in the city? What does that exactly mean?
Great, thank you.
Hi, my name is Teresa Clark. I'm a South Berkeley resident and also part of a group called South Berkeley Now, and we're very concerned about displacement and would like to see our policies for the Island Corridor have a right of return, opportunity to return. I guess I should say opportunity return, because we can't use the term right of return in this case because of the HUD definition for that. I would like, Eli, if you could, look at some of this different funding sources that the nonprofits are using. They're not always using federal money, so I don't know if you can put that in the rest of your report. The state funding sources, I think the tax credit funding is a federal source or has some, but there are state low-income housing tax credits that may or may not have the same rules as HUD. And I think in Berkeley, when the Ashby Bart was developed, many people were displaced, and that is a redevelopment criteria, so I'd like to see that looked at. In addition, the areas that had racial covenants, most of the real estate in Berkeley had racial covenants implemented over the years, and so I think that could be a policy that we could use in addition, as a way of, demonstrating that we, have these past practices similar to weight redevelopment, kicked out the African American community in San Francisco, the same kind of thing. So if you could include that kind of information, would be great.
My name is Willie Cook. My name is Willie Cook, Berkeley resident, lived in Berkeley for 45 years. I'm a affordable housing builder in the city. And I'd like to compliment Mr. Kaplan on the report this morning. I think it's a nice start. But I think one of the issues that we need to look at is affordable housing for people to buy.
Thank you.
Home ownership, affordable housing. It's a term that's not used very much. There are plenty of resources available for it. There's going to be some upcoming opportunities to provide low-income, affordable housing under some of the state and federal programs. I think the governor is moving this agenda to the top of his list, and I would like some thought given to some preferences for that item. Second, I'd like to know if there is a timetable that staff is working with from tonight to when we could expect council approval on a preference program. Is that 1 year from today? 2 years from today? I think it's well overdue that we need to make this a priority. And I mean like 12 months, if we can, if it's possible to do the due diligence that's required. There are programs, projects out there that could fit this program today. Not tomorrow, not next week, not a bunch of language, not a bunch of talking. I mean, I think it's a nice opportunity to get it done, and I think we can set Berkeley aside as a prime example on restoring, particularly South Berkeley. The impact of BART on South Berkeley is tremendous in the Black community. And
Thank you, Lily.
thank you.
Good evening. My name is Deborah Matthews. I'm a 40-year resident of Berkeley, a former commissioner to the city, serving on the Planning Commission for several years, the Housing Commission for several years, and also the Zoning Adjustments Board. There is a real need here in Berkeley to develop a communication and an influence strategy to inform our civic leaders, our activists, our business leaders, and the general public as a necessary precursor to direct work to advance bold policy changes and solutions. Changing the narrative about the causes of racial wealth inequity is a necessity precursor to gaining support to bold policies, that we get to the root of the problem. Changing the narrative includes public awareness of how government-sponsored and funded policy supported wealth building for white families while excluding families of color, and how cumulative consequences of such policies have reflected in today's racial divide, gentrification, and housing epidemic. We also need to do the debunking of some myths that Black people just need, or people of color just need to work harder in order to gain wealth. It is based in inequity and policy. Berkeley has historically been a city with implicit redlining history, racial covenant history, and limited city funding and resources for South Berkeley, West Berkeley residents. To facilitate thriving businesses, community, and effective safety nets for Berkeley's most vulnerable residents, whether they be children, working families, or the elderly. I strongly support that we begin to look at this as, you put it, an opportunity policy. I think that Willie was correct in saying that we also need to look at having people of color become shareholders in community. This is something that has been omitted for a very long time. We are not just renters in this city. We are stakeholders and a powerful voice. I recommend that we take a very close look. We sit here, we look at our planning commission today. It lacks diversity. There is no way that we can reach any equitable policy without the representation of the people that it will serve. I ask you to make the change now.
Thank you. And just to let folks know, when the beeping goes off, that does mean that the 2 minutes are up, so you can wrap up your final thought. I'm not gonna make you cut off mid-sentence, but please wrap it up.
Good evening, my name is Yana Davis. I am Director of Programs at Healthy Black Families, but I'm also a long-term Berkeley resident. Not only that, my family's been here since the 1880s. My grandmother, who died at 91 in 1976, graduated from Berkeley High. Her uncle, my great-granduncle, built houses on Ellis Street and Fulton Street. My mother worked for the UC Berkeley. My sister graduated from UC Berkeley. My children, I'm the mother of 7, 6 of my children went to Berkeley schools. I'm invested in this community. I have been an activist and an organizer here in this community since I was a teenager. I served on the Model Cities Board for South Berkeley when I was a teen. I have worked for stop signs, neighborhood parks, housing, grocery stores, food security, birth equity. I could go on and on, thinking that my children and their children would have a place in this city, a place to live. So when we think about the opportunity to to return, we also have to think about the opportunity to stay and the opportunity to own, right? We're not just talking about, like Deborah said, renters. We also are talking about homeowners, giving people the opportunity to qualify for a home. I work with a young woman. She's been qualified for Section 8 in Berkeley for over 5 years, but she cannot get a voucher. So when she goes to apply for some of the housing that opens up, she doesn't qualify. She can't pay the rent. On that note, the Bay Area is home to one of our worst racial income gaps in the United States. Structural and institutional racism has made it very difficult for Black families to enter and stay in Berkeley's middle class. When we design housing policy around middle income folks, we are leaving many Black families out, thus exacerbating Berkeley's racial wealth and income gaps. And for example, look at this chart. This is Black folks compared to everybody else. Thank you. And it goes, it's also countywide, citywide. Our children are our future. Berkeley is a thought producer for the whole world. A lot of those thoughts, that culture comes from our young Black people who now are being pushed out. We have a mass population displacement. It's not just a little bit, it's mass, it's unprecedented, and it needs to be corrected. And I encourage you to support policies that do correct it and undo the harm that's been done.
Thank you. And please share that report, send it out so that we can all see it. Thank you.
Good evening again. And certainly we have just started with this issue, and again, I want to add to the great fact that I commend you for doing this report. It's a beginning. It's a beginning because what we're starting to say is that there is a direct line between race and equity. It's a direct line here on this table and reflecting the very fact that there's no one of African American on this reflects the fact that you're making policies for people who are affected with this issue of gentrification. But I also want to say that I'd love to have a copy of that report from a particular person who has a disability. He wasn't able to get up here because he has issues with his movement. But I wanted to also basically commend you in terms of being able to at least start the particular discussion and dialogue around this. You have some renowned experts in this community, actually. One in South Berkeley, actually. I don't know if any of you know about Carl Anthony, but Carl Anthony's been talking about this for years. And we're still talking about it right here. And we're talking about it because of the very fact that no one seems to have the clarity to listen to about people who have basically been displaced. They just move out invisibly, and for the most part, they're replaced by someone else. There's an issue around residents. There's an issue around housing, people who have been here in terms of apartments. There's an issue also around homelessness. Who do you think make up the large section of homeless people in this Bay Area, actually? Many of those people were displaced in South Berkeley. So with that said, I propose that we do a workshop on gentrification. Don't you think that's important now? Don't you think that's important based on the fact that we're talking about this issue and that we should donate a time, a specific time, and you're going to get a recommendation from the council in order to make your job even easier. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again for your presentation. My name is Schwartz. I'm an active community member. I do a lot of volunteer work. I'm videotaping us Facebook Live right now. I just wanted to mention a couple of things. I'm a caregiver as well for my sister who's with disability, and I wanted to see if we could have more housing, affordable housing. What I mean by affordable housing is 30%. 30% of your income would be a good, affordable housing rate. So can we think of that in those terms? It would really help out. So housing, affordable housing, 30% for people with disabilities. We don't have a lot of that here in Berkeley, do we? So that would really help out. In addition, I would like to see taller buildings for affordable housing. For people of low income, people of different ethnicities, people who have been gentrified so that they can come back. Can we do that here in Berkeley? I know that there was only, 3 large buildings approved. Can we ever change that? We need housing. We need affordable housing now. There's a housing crisis. Affordable housing. And also, I would like to have it so that not only the rich people can have parking, we need parking too. There are a lot of people, seniors, caregivers, people with disabilities who have car needs. So I'd like to have you think about those things. Thank you very much.
Hello, Planning Commission, Mr. Cabinet, for a report that you put out, citizens of South Berkeley and Berkeley. My name is Tony Chappelle. I'm a Berkeley resident from birth. My grandmother helped found this senior citizen center. She has a photograph on the wall outside. We have been living on what used to be called Grove Street, now down back is Martin Luther King, since 1945. I think you guys have a wonderful opportunity here. Mr. Kaplan, I'd like to ask a question. You presented a panoply of different programs that are working. Is there any of those, or are there any of those that are geared, like Mr. Cook said, for buying, affordable home buying? I've been back in Berkeley for 2 years. I was on the East Coast for about 40 years. And while I was there, Michael Bloomberg made it possible for me and 165,000 moderate income, not big income, moderate income people like me to buy homes, not rent homes, buy homes. And what he did was he took the abandoned housing stock in Harlem and Brooklyn and Queens and the Bronx, and he found ways for the city of New York, Housing and Preservation Department, HUD, and the State of New York Mortgage Association to partner together so that moderate income people, 165,000 families, could buy homes. I bought a home for 1/3 of market value. I'm trying to see if this can't take root here. There's gotta be abandoned housing somewhere, there's gotta be a raw land that can be developed. I just wanna plant a seed. I'm trying to present this idea as many places as I can, and I'll wrap up. The African Methodist Episcopal Church, the Black Real Estate Brokers Association, and Wells Fargo present great opportunities for black homeowners to get together. Wells Fargo is making $60 billion available to black home buyers for the next 5 years. National Black Realtors are making a program to try to come up with 2 million new black homeowners in the next 5 years. Let's try to figure out if we don't have to reinvent some of these wheels and be able to build on things that are already working so that we can actually affect something that makes people be able to buy homes. Thank you very much.
Good morning, or good, should I say, I wish it was morning, but good evening. I just want to thank Eli for a great presentation. A lot of really important information. My name is Jasmine Poyal, and I'm an attorney at the East Bay Community Law Center. We're the largest free legal services provider here in Alameda County with offices in South Berkeley and in downtown Berkeley. Most of our clients are on the front lines of the gentrification and displacement crisis, many of which who make below 30% of the AMI and who only dreams of obtaining an affordable unit that would be available through an opportunity to return policy. And so I just want to share 2 things. One is to just uplift the voices and really echo the voices of longtime Berkeley residents, especially South Berkeley residents. They've said most of what I think and want to say tonight, but also thinking about outreach. So in terms of your research, Eli, I hope that perhaps you can share or expand information on the type of outreach that each locale made to the folks that they're trying to attract with this type of policy. Because if we think about Berkeley and we think about having a policy here, most of folks that are displaced have been displaced to outer exurbs like Pittsburgh, Antioch, Bay Point. If not that, many of them have been displaced in the Central Valley or even out of state. And what is the point of an opportunity to return policy if we're not addressing the barriers to even trying to obtain that opportunity? Also, many of those who are displaced are now on the streets, forced to live outside, and I just want to uplift their voices and also make sure that we're doing outreach to them as well. I could go on, but I will end here, but I hope we can have a lively discussion about what outreach could look like for Berkeley.
Hi, my name is Betsy Thagard, and I'm on the steering committee of South Berkeley now. We have a vision for South Berkeley, and it has 4 planks. And one of those 4 planks is asking the city to develop well-funded, strong programs that help to prevent displacement in South Berkeley and help bring some of our residents who have been displaced back. So I love this presentation. Thank you so much. It seems to me that 2 things the Planning Commission should strongly consider are having that generational tie as being part of the criteria for housing. That seems like it would help to bring people back who have been forced to leave South Berkeley. And I also know that the program that was in Cambridge also gave points to people who had children, particularly young children, which would be really helpful for some of the families who are experiencing so much stress related to displacement in our community. And lastly, I'd like to note that I think the city of Portland also has an affordable housing purchase program that's based on generational ties. So perhaps we could look into that as an example for our area too. Thank you.
Opportunity to own.
Okay, real quick, we need to have a Berkeley AMI. We have to have based on the Berkeley income and not the Alameda County. And I like a copy of Eli's. Yeah, good. That's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, I don't see any more public comment on this item. There'll be more opportunity for public comment after the next presentation. But I wanted to see, we do need to be mindful of the time. Are there any questions that planning commissioners have for Eli specifically about his presentation? We'll have more time for discussion later, but I want to get our questions out and then give Eli a few minutes to respond to all the questions that have been asked. So are there any questions for Eli that haven't already come up through the meeting? Yeah.
Thanks, Eli. Looking forward to this. I'm curious if, as part of the research, if you're going to do any analysis, sort of quantification of which approach, sort of which types of units, et cetera, would get the most impact in Berkeley. You don't have to explain that. I just want to know if you're incorporating that into the paper.
Yeah, I am. Yeah, I would say. Yeah.
We're going to answer everybody's questions at once, but first see if there are any other questions from the commission. I saw Steve and then Rob.
I guess this might also pertain to what we're going to discuss later, but I want to ask you, since you're here as part of the Alameda County corridor presentation, if you have already applied some of the ideas that you have presented to what Ms. Shen is trying to put together as a plan, and if you have, that's what we would like to hear.
And Rob?
Yeah, well, I'm glad that it's possible to do preference policies if they're being successfully done. My question is, like, have you collected any data as to what the current situation is? Does the city collect any data as to people in inclusionary units and low market rate housing? How many of them, what percentage of them actually have lived or worked in Berkeley? It would be useful to know that. The city is collecting statistics on the construction, how many units, we know how many units are in the pipeline, how many units have been built. It would be nice if we could have some data as to actually who's occupying these below market affordable units.
One more question here and then there.
You may be planning to answer this anyway, but I was just hoping that when you do answer questions, if you're able, if you've thought already about how you're going to, I think the next step started with looking at making recommendations for Berkeley from what you've seen elsewhere, what you've been studying. And if you have a sense of what that is, that would make what you're looking at post Berkeley, you know, how you're planning to draw that so that you can make a recommendation for us.
Great, thank you. So sorry. Ella?
Thank you for being here. And my question is similar, but of the cities and policies that you studied, I'm curious what you think would be most effective and strongest for Berkeley, especially when it comes to preventing displacement.
And Ben?
Eli, thank you so much for your excellent research. And I wanted to ask, picking up on what I thought was an excellent question about the gap between opportunity to return and right to return policies, whether you'll have an opportunity to look sort of outside the scope of some of these, what's been enacted in major cities, and look at measures that have been more aggressive in providing more or less a right to return. I've worked with an organization that did it in Los Angeles through a community benefits agreement. So I know it can be done because we've done it. And also just as a part of that, considering workarounds. If HUD funding is the problem, can you write a policy that says if we receive HUD funding, then we won't have this aggressive right to return policy, and otherwise we will. So just not being sort of bound necessarily by what other cities happen to have chosen to do, but what would be more effective from a policy standpoint. Because I also just have to say that I was sort of left with the impression, hearing your presentation, that there's this like constant looming threat of legal challenge, and I would like the next time around, I'd like to understand if that's really accurate. I feel like we have to weigh like, policy goals against what the reality of the legal concerns actually are, as opposed to like in this one instance, HUD reviewed it and said no. If that's the only instance, then I'm not sure we should be sitting here quaking because there might be some legal review.
All right, thank you. So, Eli, I'm going to give you a few minutes to, I know that was a lot of questions. Some of them you might have responses to in the research that you've done. Some of them you might be able to incorporate in further research, but if you want to just take some time now and give responses to questions that you can.
Sure.
Yeah, please use the mic.
Yeah. So, hi everyone. A few questions that are pretty straightforward to clarify. So in terms of working in Berkeley, that would be that your employment is physically located in Berkeley. It doesn't mean working for the city. And then with any of these preferences, also to clarify, it's not like having this preference gives you an automatic preference for affordable housing. You would also, of course, have to qualify by income. So there's a comment about being a tech worker, and I mean, if that tech worker's income was low enough to qualify for affordable housing, then they would get the preference. So that's what working in Berkeley means. And then the Ashby-Bart displacement and other policies related to government policies related to exclusion is a good point and is something we're looking into. In other cities, with San Francisco and Portland, it was city-funded urban renewal that preferences are tied to, which there was less of in Berkeley, but as we know, there was the Ashby-Bart construction and also the history of redlining, and so those are things we're looking into. And then, in terms of opportunity to remain and return, so largely the policies that exist are more opportunity to remain because they are preferences for current city residents. And so it's the opportunity to return part that is kind of a bit more innovative and harder to come by. And so that's what we're hoping to accomplish with this research, is both that it would be opportunity to remain and opportunity to return. The comments about affordable home ownership are interesting. There is affordable home ownership, as someone mentioned, in Portland and also in Cambridge. I'm unfortunately not totally aware, so I'd have to defer of the current status of affordable home ownership programs in Berkeley. If they existed, perhaps this policy could apply to them also, but my directive was to look at in relation to current construction of rental housing. So I unfortunately don't know the answer to that with home ownership in Berkeley. And then timetable for implementing, I would also have to defer to. I'm not sure what the plan is with council and with health, housing, and community services. My report will be ready by the summer, and that would inform the next steps, but I'm not sure what the next steps are. And then, in terms of, what outreach cities did, that is a good question. And definitely in Portland, there was intensive outreach. I think with the way, it was also a good point that it's difficult to do outreach to displaced communities here when it's often too far out. I observed in Portland, I think the nature of their metro area there was probably less of a barrier. But anyway, and then in San Francisco also did extensive community outreach in developing its policy, so I think that is a worthy recommendation that I would include in my report. And then in terms of questions for the Planning Commission, quantitative analysis on impact is definitely something I'm looking into. I have some data on nonprofit unit production and inclusionary unit production, and also looking at kind of spatial analysis where affordable housing is being produced in Berkeley, and so how different preference categories, whether it be by neighborhood or general city resident, what type of impact that might have. And then relation to this work serving the Adeline plan. I've been, my main client for the project is Health, Housing, and Community Services, but I'm also working with Elisa in planning, and then this information will shape recommendations that are in the plan. And then, unfortunately, there is not currently data on whether people in affordable units, whether inclusionary or nonprofit in Berkeley, whether they were previously Berkeley residents. And so I think a program like this provides a good opportunity if the program is being implemented by the city, and then the city's doing the screening, then the city would have a sense of who is getting into units. And so I would imagine, I'm in contact with the city of San Francisco, since they have more of a direct role, that they might have that data, and then as I mentioned, Cambridge does collect that data. And then determining what fits well with Berkeley, that is a good question. And I guess kind of looking at there, I mean, it depends on sort of the issues at hand and the goals that the policy is trying to address. So looking in terms of what categories would fit well, I guess a policy would be effective if it is housing, providing the most opportunity for Berkeley residents to remain and return. And so that's kind of yet to be addressed and is part of the further research. That wasn't really much of an answer, I'm sorry. But I'm still kind of evaluating my case studies, and I think that's a matter for further conversation and further community outreach to determine what is the best fit for Berkeley. And I think that was all the questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And somebody asked about this PowerPoint. It will be available afterwards in the meeting. Can we also email it out to people who sign up? Are people giving their email addresses? Yeah. Great. So if you signed up in the back and gave your email address, we can email out all the materials from tonight. Yeah? Great. So thank you. We're going to move to the next item, which is called number 11, which is housing and community benefits ideas for the Adeline corridor.
Chris, can I just
Sure.
I just wanted to say I have to walk out by 8:45,
Oh, yeah.
so I just wanted to apologize to my colleagues and to the speaker, because I really want to hear this.
You have to before you walk out. We'll let you do. Well, we're going to listen to this presentation and then do public comment. Does that work?
Just 1 minute. I'll wait.
Okay. Wait until public comment. So we'll hear.
I was gonna comment while we were sitting there.
Okay, I think we're ready.
I think they're ready.
Yeah. Thank you for having me tonight. My name is Rick Jacobus. I'm a consultant. I'm one of the sub-consultants working on the Adeline Corridor plan, and I was tasked to think about the housing and community benefits issues as part of the overall planning process.
Can people in the back hear him okay? It's okay?
How's that? Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So, many of you, I think, were involved or engaged at one point or another in the outreach for the plan. There was a lot of community feedback about the need for community benefits. And I just want to summarize a little bit of what we heard and then reflect a little bit on how we tried to incorporate that into the draft plan. And we made some choices, and I want to walk through a little bit of the logic behind the choices. When you see the plan, you'll just see the choices. You won't necessarily get the context. So the goal here is to sort of explain the rationale. In order to do that, I felt like we have to show you some of what's going to be in the draft plan. But I want to just encourage people that when you actually see the whole plan, you'll have an opportunity to comment on it. You'll have an opportunity to question me more about some of this background. You'll have the opportunity to question the staff more about why the details are the way they are. So I want, as much as we can, even though I'm going to show some of the details, I want everyone to think about the big picture. Like, is this the right kind of strategy for this community, or is it not? And then the details, we still need feedback. So when we get the plan out, I expect we'll get a lot of comments on, did we get the details of this right or not? So one of the things that we heard, one of the key motivating questions in the community feedback that we heard in just about every forum that we got feedback on was, well, if there's going to be development in this community, who's going to benefit? Who's it going to be for? Who fundamentally receives the benefit from new growth or new building? And what we heard no one agrees on everything. There's nothing that everyone agrees on. But what we heard from a lot of people was, we're okay with some growth and some change, but we want to make sure that it's for the benefit of the community and not just to sort of make money for someone. We talked through and we thought through a range of different approaches to community benefits. How do we make sure development benefits the community? And a lot of cities have done complex systems to try to balance these benefits. And we looked at systems where you get points for different kinds of community benefits, and you have to sort of check off several boxes. We looked at systems where each project is negotiated. We looked at systems where people charge a fee, and the whole thing is just done through impact fees, or where there's a community fund and money is put in, and then there's a process for spending that money on community benefits. The underlying concept that underlies a lot of those approaches and is this idea of land value capture. And the basic concept is, when we make policy changes that allow more intense development, that tends to result in higher land values. And land value capture is basically the idea that as we do that, we can make choices that capture some of that value for these community benefits. The extent to which you capture value is, in some sense, in this framework, is in some sense a function of how much you're increasing what people can build. So in this community, there's also concern about how intense development can be. So there's a trade-off between how much community benefits are available for us to be building a system with, on the one hand, and how much we change the character of the community by allowing higher, more dense development. If you were building high rises, which no one is talking about here, you would have more opportunity to capture more community benefit, because there'd be more land value increase to capture. We asked people about you can't read that at all, I'm sorry. We asked people about a lot of different community benefits, from bike infrastructure to streetscape improvements to job training, public open space. As you heard already tonight, we heard very similar in each one of the community outreach opportunities for the plan, a strong emphasis on housing affordability and affordable housing. Lots of concerns about what the terminology is, what income level, but overwhelmingly, we heard a concern that the community is at risk, that displacement has been happening and has been changing the character of the community. There's a general concern about housing costs and displacement, and also a specific concern about the displacement of the historic African American community. And over again, we heard that was the highest, most urgent priority in terms of community benefits. So what we tried to do is to construct the plan to maximize the degree to which this neighborhood sees new, affordable housing at a range of income levels, and that's the primary emphasis for the community benefit strategy in the draft plan. The plan provides a lot of these other benefits in one way or another, but for the most part, we've not suggested that developers have a choice between building bike infrastructure or building affordable housing or building open space or building affordable housing, because we heard affordable housing was the top priority. So we've tried not to give up housing affordability in exchange for other benefits, but to get those other benefits when we can. There's one large exception to that, which is that we heard also that there was a very high priority on preserving the Ashford Green. And the plan will not provide a detailed strategy for the development of the BART sites. There's no drawings, there's no pictures, but the plan calls for
building housing on the BART site, primarily affordable housing, and it calls for including on the site a permanent public plaza that would be suitable for as a permanent home for the flea market and also for the farmer's market if that's appropriate. And that's not free. That's going to cost money and it's going to take up space, and it may be that that makes it harder to finance the maximum amount of affordable housing on that site. But we heard that that was an important thing for the community's identity and for particularly for the African American community in this neighborhood. So that's the big exception. The rest of what I want to talk about tonight is, so how do we maximize the amount of affordable housing in a community like this? The plan calls for a target of 50% of all new housing units to be affordable at a range of income levels. That's a very ambitious goal. That's not something that most specific plans outline. That's not something that we've achieved in most neighborhoods in America. It's not going to be an easy thing to do, and there's a lot of details to how you would do that. So what I want to walk through for the rest of this presentation is, what might that look like? How could we achieve 50% affordability? Because my opinion is that it's possible. It's something that could be done, and we've written the plan in a way to make it more likely, but it's going to take more than just what a plan can deliver to make that a real outcome. So there's a number of components in the sort of housing chapter in the plan. There's a number of different elements, but I want to talk about the two things that are the key to delivering on that goal. And that is inclusionary housing, or on-site affordable housing units, and the public sites, and in particular the two BART parking lots. Neither of these two tools can get you to 50% of the housing in the neighborhood being affordable, but together they can. So first I want to talk about inclusionary housing. When we were talking about land value capture, Berkeley already has a very robust land value capture program in the form of the housing mitigation fee. Right now, a developer that wants to build on the Adeline corridor has to pay almost $38,000 per unit into the housing mitigation fee. If they choose, they can provide 20% affordable units on site. And half of those units have to be affordable at 80% of median income, and half have to be affordable at 50%. So low income and very low income. And none of them have to be affordable at the very lowest income. The mitigation fee that Berkeley charges, when we look at the sort of economics of projects that have come through and had to share their pro formas with the city, the mitigation fee captures a large portion of what would be the sort of land value capture opportunity if I were to come in and do this analysis without that being in place already. You're already capturing most of what there is to capture for community benefits in this one fee. And just to give a little bit of context, Grounded Solutions Network did a survey of 800 and some inclusionary housing programs around the country, and they found that only 10% require more than 20% of the units to be affordable. So you're at the high end. You're not off the chart, but you're at the high end of what other communities require in terms of housing, affordable housing and market rate projects. And then we looked at the housing mitigation fee plus the other community benefits fees that the city charges, and compared that to a few other cities. And you're just a bit above what the sort of nearby cities like Emeryville or Oakland are charging, or what sort of other college towns, Davis or Santa Cruz, are charging. So that's not to say that you're charging too much. It's just to say you're already in the ballpark. So when you talk to people who are deep in the numbers about what works and what doesn't work, some people think it's too high. Some people think it's too low. But what I don't hear a lot is that it's totally out of the ball. It's not way too high or way too low, right? You're capturing a large share of what could be captured. So that makes it hard to come up with a strategy for this plan, because you've already done sort of the biggest thing that you would do to maximize the affordable housing from units. But one thing that we heard was that developers are more often choosing to pay the fee than to build units on site. So we focused on how do we get how do we change the psychology for the developers, or the incentives for the developers, so that they're more likely to provide the on-site units instead of to pay the fee. Now, I just want to say in defense of the fee, when you get the fee, the city does good things with that money, and it's actually very helpful to get the fees. But in terms of this community, where displacement is such a concern, there seems to be an overwhelming reason to focus on on-site. A reason that isn't present in every community, and might not even be present in many other parts of Berkeley. It makes sense here to focus on on-site units, even if it's a little bit less efficient. So, I want to give an example of sort of what the trade-offs are, so that you can see how we're talking about incentivizing that change. But I want to warn you a little bit, because I'm going to show numbers, and my numbers are not based on having done a comprehensive feasibility study. The city has commissioned a number of those in the past. I've looked at them, I've used those numbers to produce this, but I haven't done a study of every possible development that might happen in the Adeline corridor and how it might be impacted by these fees. What I've done is constructed an example that's a realistic example based on the real projects that have come through recently, and it gives us a way to sort of gauge the sort of rough trade-off that we're talking about. But it's not the average project, and there's a lot of projects that are going to look different one way or another from this project. Some are going to be much more profitable, some are going to be less profitable. This is just one example. So right now, through much of the Adeline corridor, you have the CSA zoning, which doesn't provide a specific density limit. It says you can go, in some places it says you can go 3 stories. I just said, what if we did a third of an acre project, and we looked at the setbacks and the other requirements, and we said you could get roughly 27 units under the current base zoning on a third of an acre. That's something like 80 units per acre, depending exactly on the size. If you did that, you'd have to pay the housing mitigation fee of almost $1 million, and you'd earn a yield on your project of 5.4%. So I'm going to just define this term, yield on cost. This is sort of a profit measure. So that the yield on cost is one of several ways that developers talk about how profitable a project is. It's not the best way, it's just the one that converts most easily between different projects and lets you sort of compare. It's very quick and simple if you like math. So the yield on cost is basically the extent to which the income every year from a project, how much that is relative to what it costs to build that project. So if you spent $1 million to build something and it generated $60,000 a year, that would be a 6% yield on cost. And another way to think about it is, if you put $1 million in the bank and you earn 6% interest on your money every year, you get $60,000 out. That's the yield on cost. The developer, that's not what the developer earns, because the developer borrows money from the bank and they take money from investors and they each have different rates. It's what the project generates. So in Berkeley right now, developers will tell you 6% yield is a good target. We'd like to be earning 6% yield. And when we look at projects recently, we're seeing projects that are coming in and they seem not to be generating quite a 6% yield. So it seems like below 6%, projects are still happening, but they're more marginal. So I'm saying a project above 6%, pretty much anyone would want to do. And a project, as you get below 6%, the further you are below 6%, the harder it's going to be to find a developer that's willing to do it, or an investor that's willing to invest in it. And we don't know where that cutoff is. But it seems likely that somewhere around 5.5%, you get to the point where there's no developer left that wants to do the project. And again, this is not about what's morally right or who's entitled to what. This is just predicting the behavior of profit-motivated investors and developers. So it seems like between 5.5% and 6%, we have marginal projects that are happening, and above 6%, we have a good, solid return and we feel more comfortable. Now, all of these numbers are changing all the time, so we have a snapshot in time. So remember I said that the current zoning, the number I came up with in my example project was 5.4% yield on cost. So I don't think someone's going to build that. And you don't see a lot of projects coming through right now building in total conformance with the current zoning in the Adeline corridor. What's happening instead is that developers are asking for use permits to allow them to get higher density. And exactly how far you can go with that is really project by project. It's different for each project. And then once you get your use permits to a higher degree of density, then you can apply the state density bonus. And the state density bonus allows you to go even higher. So we did some calculations that are imperfect and would be different for different sites. But the one example we have here is if you have that same third of an acre project, if you build to the highest you can under the current rules is a 4.0 FAR, and then you take the state density bonus on top of that, you can get even higher. So you could get to something like 72 units on that third of an acre site. So that's a 215 units per acre. It's a big change in how dense the project is. And notice how that turns out. It's also a pretty noticeable change in the developer's profit. So that gets you from a project that probably no one would build to a project that probably most people would build. These numbers are changing, so I'm not saying development is exactly this profitable. I'm saying, in my example, this is what that looks like. In order to get the state density bonus, the developer has to provide affordable housing units. The way to do that works best with the city's housing mitigation ordinance is to provide 11% very low income units. You get a 35% density bonus if you provide 11% very low income units. And under Berkeley's ordinance, you would also pay a remainder fee, because you were supposed to provide 20% under the housing mitigation fee. So if you provide some units on site, then you have a lower fee that you pay. But you'd still owe $1.8 million on this project. I also want to point out that 11% is a really confusing number here. And I'm sorry, I wish there was a way to present this without having to make people think about this, because it hurts me to think about it. I've been thinking about it for years. It's not 11% of 72 units. It's 11% of 27 units. Right. It's 11% of the base, not 11% of the total. Sorry. But you'll see that makes a big difference in how many units. So if we just raise the base, and people just keep doing exactly what they've been doing, we'd get more affordable units on site, because they'd be doing 11% of a higher base. So that's what we're trying to do. The draft plan, and you'll all have a chance to weigh in on whether these are the right numbers, but the draft plan is suggesting that we switch to a specific density per acre, number of units per acre, and then it'd be different in different zones. And there'll be lots of time to comment on whether these are the right numbers for each zone, but think about the general idea. Now, if we have a density per acre, the limit can be, the base can be higher, and people can take units off, add those 11% off a higher base. But the way that the draft is written right now, the units per acre targets are higher than the current base zoning, but lower than the maximum that people are able to get to with use permits today. So for example, in the South Shattuck area, the base zoning in the draft is 120 units per acre. So for my third of an acre site, that would give you 39 units. So not 27 and not 72. And if you were to pay the fee, which would be $1.3 million for that project, you'd have a return of 5.7%. So not 5.4 like you'd have with the base zoning, but also not 5.96 like you could possibly get to today. So we're raising the base, but not to the maximum. And the reason that we're doing that is because we're then offering what we're calling an on-site affordable housing incentive. And the idea is that if people want to go higher than that base, they do it in exchange for higher levels of affordable housing. And again, I really hope people will give us comments on exactly what the balance is, but I also hope people will think about, is that a good idea in general, right? That more density, more height, more units on a lot in exchange for more affordable units. Is that the right way to go? So here's just the trade-off that we've provided in the initial draft. So if you went to 120 as your new base, if you used the state bonus and you did 11% of the base units, you can get up to 161 units. That's a 35% bump. If instead, you could choose one of these local incentive programs. So you could go up to 170 units per acre in exchange for 20% of the units being affordable. And again, it's the base. Or you could go to 200 units per acre for 35% affordable, or 240 for 50% affordable. Okay? So just to give a sort of a math example here, the on-site incentive, the base for if the base was 120 units, that's 39 units for a third of an acre. If you took the lowest tier incentive, you could get up to 56 units, and that increases the yield on cost, but only a little bit, right? It's only going up from 5.71 to 5.73. And so think about, well, we just increased the density pretty significantly. There's a lot more units. Why isn't it a lot more profitable? And the reason is because you're also providing a lot more affordable housing. And what we're trying to do is to balance how much extra it's worth to put more housing there against how much extra you pay or it costs you to provide more affordable housing. So that the benefit of that extra density is all going to more affordable housing, right? Or very close to all. So I just want to give you some examples to sort of think about how much difference does this make. And if you don't like math, you can just think about something else for a minute. This is for the math people. So I did, how much is it really worth to just increase the density? What if we held the affordable housing requirement constant, and we said, no matter what density, you have to just do 8 units of affordable housing. If we build at 170 units an acre, the return that I come up with is 5.73. If you were to build at only 80 units per acre, you'd get a yield of 4.75, right? So it's about a 1 percentage point difference. And if you were able to build all the way up at 240, you could get up to 5.95. So it doesn't keep doubling as you go up because it gets more expensive. But the range here, I think, is really important. People don't have an instinctive understanding of how valuable these things are. And I should say, a different project would look a little different. But I think it's really helpful to sort of see that range, just to kind of train our instincts. Because even those of us who do this all the time, I can't guess what these numbers are going to be. You have to do the math and then sort of work it out and say, oh, that's what it is. So that's how much density is worth if we're staying within this range. Then, instead, what if we hold the density constant and we say, how much does the affordable housing requirement affect the returns, right? So it turns out, if we say we're going to stick to 170 units per acre, but we could lower the affordable housing requirement all the way to 0, or we could go all the way up to 40%, and I'm doing half at 50% of median and half at 80. It doesn't make an enormous difference. It does affect the return, and it's the difference between a project that's going to get built and a project that's not going to get built, but not by a whole lot. Let me just put it into a little bit of more context. So construction costs have been going up really fast lately, 4 to 5% a year for multiple years, year after year. That is really unusual, and it's the first thing any developer raises when you talk about this with them, because it's a big struggle to deal with this change. So here's what happens. Here's how sensitive that return is to what we assume about the construction cost. A 4% plus or minus difference in the construction cost covers just about the same range as the affordable housing numbers I was just showing. So if construction costs are going up 4% a year, and our whole housing program is having about the same effect as 1 year's worth of change in construction costs, we will certainly, if construction costs continue to go up like this, we will certainly reach a point, and there's a decent chance we've already reached it, but we will definitely reach a point where, regardless of what you do about density, and regardless of what you do about affordable housing, no one will be able to build. It's not going to pencil. We may not be there yet, but we're headed that way, and this policy decision is important, and it's the thing the city can control, but it's not the thing driving the fundamental economics of real estate development in the Adeline corridor. One more of these numbers, and then I'll be done with the numbers. Parking. Parking is really expensive. There's been a move to lower parking requirements. The draft plan will provide parking requirements that are lower than what people have expected in the past. But what we've heard from developers is in the Adeline corridor, it's likely that projects will include parking even if the city didn't require it at all. Because investors and tenants, or homebuyers, are going to want parking. But the good news is they don't want as much as they wanted 20 years ago. So we're making progress as a society, but here's how much the parking ratio affects the return. If you got it all the way down to 0, your 5.73 yield goes up to 5.84. If you go up to 1, I assume 0.5. Not because that's what the plan says, but because that's what I think the lowest likely scenario is. But if you go up to 1, it reduces return to 5.61. So it could be that parking is the difference between a project being feasible or not being feasible, or someone going forward or not. Just how many parking spaces can we put in. This is a terrible time to be doing this kind of analysis because the market is at this really bad point, and it's not our fault, but we have to deal with it. So here's the kind of bottom line, and again, these are just example numbers. If someone was to build the proposed base, I'm suggesting in my example project, they'd get a 5.7 return. If they built the bonus, the local incentive at 20% affordable, they can increase the return very slightly to 5.73. As they go up, their return comes down a little bit, but not a lot. So what this says is, the way we've got the relationship between the affordable units and the density set up here, there's not a strong incentive or a strong disincentive to choose any point, but there's a slight incentive to choose the 20% on site. It will be, I think what that will mean is that there'll be some projects that will prefer more density, they'll prefer to be bigger, and they'll have to do 50% affordable, and they'll be able to do that because we've made it possible. And there'll be other projects that will prefer to do either the base zoning or the lower incentives, and they'll be able to do that because we've fine-tuned it. So that's the goal. The question I think people should think about as you read the plan is, should we incentivize it more? Do we want more density and more affordability? Should we incentivize it less? Is that relationship right? Would we rather see, the returns go up as you go higher? Or is it okay if they're similar but not increasing or decreasing a little bit, right? That's the thing to think about as you go through the plan. So I'm going to move now to the other half of the strategy, which is public land. So, I'm sorry, this one's shorter. But I think you can see here, we don't get to 50% of all new housing is affordable this way. Not everyone's going to choose to do it. This is based on the base. We don't totally get there. So we need the public land to get there. There's a number of public sites in the neighborhood that are owned by public agencies that could be appropriate for affordable housing. The plan identifies them, but the two that are largest and sort of critical are the two BART parking lots. As I said before, we haven't done a design. There's no proposal for exactly what will happen at BART. Instead, the plan proposes that the city work with BART and with the community to do a process where people can come and identify what they need from the BART site, what the priorities are, and then participate in selecting a master developer who will try to build a project. The specifics of how many units you can get on the site are going to depend on who that developer is and what those priorities are. The plan just says that there should be a process for that. But we've done some numbers to sort of estimate how many housing units you could get on the site. And the strategy that the draft plan recommends is to prioritize affordable housing on those BART sites, to make them primarily affordable housing. And so that means you could get between 500 and 675 affordable housing units on that site. And that could be ownership, it could be rental, It could be supportive housing, it could be transitional housing. It's just saying, we have this rare resource in this public land, let's use it first to meet that affordable housing need. You see the number up here, 75% affordable. It may be that you can do more affordable housing and serve more people if you also have some other market rate housing or other uses on the site. But the idea is not to have it be only affordable housing, but rather to have the production of affordable housing be the thing that drives what you choose to do there. I want to talk a little bit about income, I know that people are concerned about like, what's really affordable. When we say affordable, is it really affordable? Who's it affordable to? And I wish I had a better answer to that question. The proposal in the plan is to let developers bid on who's going to build and have, think about how much affordable housing can we get and how affordable is it as how we're going to evaluate those proposals. The specifics of like what financing sources they use are what drive exactly how affordable the units are. But nonetheless, I want to show some numbers just so you have a sense of the kind of thing that happens. And so this is, we looked at rental projects, so not ownership, rental projects that are developed as 100% affordable rental projects, usually with the low-income housing tax credit. And the state collects data on what income level they serve, and this is the statewide distribution. 20% of the units end up for people below 30% of median income, and that is all the way down to 0. For the most part, those units are up, pay what you can. It's based on your income. As you go up the income scale, the majority of the tax credit units are for people in the 40 to 50% of AMI range. And so for a family of 3, that would be $52,000 a year income, and your rent would be something like $1,300. So this is why I know people are saying, well, that's not affordable. For a single person in a studio, the rent would be less and the income cutoff would be less. But this is the majority of the financing that's available for affordable housing. The one other thing I want to point out is that Eli was showing how in Cambridge, a large share of their residents also had Section 8. So sometimes you have units that are targeted at one income level, but the tenant has Section 8, which means the tenant pays what they can afford to pay, not whatever this formula shows. So last number, and a really important number. In order to do that, the city of Berkeley would have to provide some of the financing. Most of the financing would come from the federal government. Some of the financing would come from the state of California. Some of it would come from Alameda County. But you can't get it built at all if the city doesn't put something in. We're roughly estimating that to do the scale of development that we just talked about, the city would have to put in between $50 and $130 million of city of Berkeley money. And because of the way the financing works, it's not likely that you would build 500 or more affordable housing units at once. You take the sites and you break them up into smaller projects, and they get built over a number of years. So one of the things that people should think about when they think about this strategy is it worth it to have to wait a while to build in phases? The phases can be different. Some can be ownership, some can be rental, etc. But is it worth it to build in phases in order to maximize the affordable housing? Because it doesn't seem possible to finance all of the affordable housing that could go there in one fell swoop. That's not something that seems practical. But the good news for that is, if it's going to cost the city money, the city just did a $100 million bond for affordable housing. I think one of the ways that you have to evaluate whether this is a realistic strategy is, do you think that the city of Berkeley and the voters of Berkeley would do that again? Because while you could put some of that money into this, you couldn't put it all into this, so you'd need another bond or another financing source of that scale. I think the good news is this is a number that's sort of in scale with what Berkeley's capable of doing. The question is, will Berkeley do that? So I'm going to stop there. I know there's going to be a lot of questions and comments. Sorry to take so long.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to acknowledge we have about 50 minutes left until we have to leave tonight. The place will close and the staff need to go home. We also have a few more agenda items that I don't think will take very long, but I'd like to reserve the last 20 minutes to make sure that we get to those items. So we have about a half an hour for comment. So can I get a sense of how many people want to speak? Is it going to be, okay. I'm tempted to say a minute each. I hate to do that, but I do want to make sure that the workers who work here get to go home. And there might be some comments that the Planning Commission wants to make. So my apologies for the short time. I ask everybody to respect that so we can all talk. So we'll open it up for public comment. So please come on up.
Hi, I'm Janice Chang, and I live in South Berkeley, and I have 3 very quick questions. You talked about how our affordable housing mitigation fee is robust, and you compared it to Davis, Oakland, Emeryville, Fremont, but there's a huge reason why people want to live in Berkeley and not live in Fremont. And I noticed San Francisco wasn't on that list, and I'm wondering if you have the numbers for that. The other question I have is when you talked about how much it would cost, what the yield cost would be, I'm wondering if that considers the cost of administering the affordable units, because the impression I've gotten from talking to developers is they don't want to build affordable units. They'd rather pay the fee and get it done with than not have to deal with the administration. And I'm wondering how to incentivize them to build the units, because I really think affordable units is what we really need. And then my third question is, you talk a lot about the unit size and the units per acre. And what about the monkeying around with the unit size? We just had a project that was built that started out at 23 units, and then they made it 5 units by making 5 and 6 bedroom units. Right. And that's how they monkeyed around with getting the affordable housing mitigation fee lowered. And how can we not have that in this?
Thank you, Jen.
Thank you.
Good evening, John Lau, resident of the area, also here with the South Berkeley Now group. We've talked a couple times on this item in the workshops over the past few years, and so I appreciate the innovative and creative thinking from staff and consultant team. It was a little hard to see some of the details back there, and so we look forward to seeing how things translate from a single hypothetical site to plan-wide. My overall just concern, which I've shared before, is that we are generating enough value through this to actually bring to bear some of the great ideas we've talked about for years and years. I think in one of the scenarios you were walking through, the end result was we weren't really allowing much more in terms of development potential than exists now in our current zoning, which begs the question, what value have we created, and begs the further question, what value are we going to capture to actually accomplish some of these goals that we've gone through. So it's a big question. I really hope we consider the tools that we have at our disposal, like height. It's great that we have a state density one, but let's think and make sure we used everything in our toolkit to create as much value as we can.
Peter Waller, long-term resident of South Berkeley. Thank you for this whole conversation, Rick. That was great. I've worked in affordable housing for a long time, so I sort of understand that stuff, but that was a great presentation. In a sense, building on what John said, and I'm also a member of South Berkeley Now, there are so many things we want to do here. I'd love to build 500 units of affordable housing, just at BART. I'd love to build another 500 units of market rate housing, not just for its own sake, but in part because of the resources it will bring to help us with the open space, supporting local businesses, narrowing the streets, pulling all of these things together. And I'm just going to say, I want affordable housing throughout the community. I want it in between our existing homes. I want it in small buildings and big buildings. So I think there's a way to spread that public benefit and the public land out across the neighborhood. I don't think we have to just look at the BART as the only place to build affordable housing. So it's a whole complex strategy. Thank you guys for thinking about this.
I'm Margie Wilkinson. I'm with Friends of Adeline. Hi, Rick. The first thing I want to say is that the most important thing I got from Rick's report is that the problem is the profit that people make off of housing. And I know Berkeley can't do away with profit, but that's the problem. And we will never solve the housing problem without doing away with a lot of the profit that is made out of housing. It's criminal. It's where people live. It's their homes. The people who are sleeping on our streets don't have houses because greedy people are making profit out of housing. Okay. And I want us to be as creative as possible. I want us to have as much affordable housing as possible. I want to talk about London. There's an article, it was in the New York Times on March 1st, about housing in London. I think you all should look at it. Now I know this is nonprofit housing, but what they have done is taken what they call estates, what do they call them? You know, where they're public housing projects, and they're renovating them to include market rate units. And the market rate units are subsidizing the poor people who live right next door to them in the same units, in the same buildings, use the same elevators. Okay, I'm done. Thank you. March 1. It's called New York Has a Public Housing Problem. Does London have an answer? Thanks. It's a great article.
Good evening again. Hi, thank you for your presentations. I want to encourage us to think about how we can not just make affordable housing, but support people in affording the housing. If Berkeley doesn't have money for Section 8 anymore, then there has to be an alternative to Section 8, right? And the city has to, with those bonds, maybe attach money for the housing, as well as think about in terms of the density, like Margie said, all that Margie said actually, could certainly support it. And finally, I agree, this housing just can't be concentrated in South Berkeley and West Berkeley. It has to be all over the city. We have to begin to move beyond this segregation and institutionalized capitalistic supported way of how we're living in Berkeley that is totally detrimental, excuse me, to our social determinants of health.
Yes, good evening. If we really want to build a house, we actually have to. Is this on?
Yeah, introduce yourself.
I'm Tim Frank. I'm the director of the Center for Sustainable Neighborhoods, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Alameda County Building and Construction Trades Council as well this evening. If we want to build housing, we actually have to have people who are going to build it for us, a construction workforce. One of the reasons why we've seen the skyrocketing costs associated with housing is the shortage of workers for residential construction in particular. And the key to addressing this challenge is to find ways to recruit, train, and retain workers. And we know what the solutions are. That means making sure that we're actually providing apprenticeship opportunities, that we're actually paying prevailing wages, and then we're making sure that there's portable healthcare systems that's available to workers that are portable from job to job to job. Because we know that that's the key to actually retaining the workers. And we also know that South Berkeley and West Berkeley are the places in Berkeley from which construction workers actually come to Berkeley. Much of the rest of the community, from Berkeley, they've been displaced by gentrification long ago. But these are neighborhoods where they're coming from, and we need to make opportunities here. So thanks.
Hi, my name is Lisa Clark, and I'm with South Berkeley now. Thank you, Rick, for all your work on this. A couple things. I looked at the 29 of Adeline, that was 18 unit space. And is that the one we looked at as an example? Okay. Yeah, so definitely we need to increase the base density so we can create more affordable housing for all income levels. And one of the things that we're missing is the nonprofits, they can do the 60% AMI and below, but who's going to do the 60 to 80? The nonprofits aren't really going to do that. And who's going to do the 80 to 120%? People who want to own homes. So I think I kind of look toward doing being more inclusionary for those income groups that cannot be subsidized by the nonprofit. So the nonprofit can, take care of those with the tax credit programs. So that was one point. And the other point is I think we really need to look at the way transportation funding and grants can also about the OBAG funding, the HIP funding, and then there's some other funding, and how do we leverage that by increasing the density? So hopefully those will get back into the community benefits portion of it, not just affordable housing versus community benefit, but how do we leverage other money for community benefits?
I guess I'm back again. I just wanted to incline that you have one particular developer, actually, of color, Willie Cook. And no doubt that's part of the whole issue. Whatever you do, include equity in this.
My name is Ariella Burnett. I'm also with South Berkeley now. I live a couple blocks away. Thank you for the informative presentation. I just wanted to remind everyone that the UN Climate Council report that was came out last fall said we have about 10 years, just 1 decade, to change the way we do things. And so with that in mind, time is of the essence. I'm a real proponent of density at the BART station, and to move quickly. I'm an architect. I've worked on many affordable housing projects, and I know they take a while. So I'd like to encourage you to support policies that will make projects happen sooner than later, even if that comes with a balance of market rate and affordable. Thank you.
Deborah Matthews, South Berkeley now. First, I want to say, Rick, thank you so much for your presentation. I think one of the key things that you brought to us and really provided a lot of information and education was on increasing the base. That is one way to effectively get our housing, more affordable housing. I think that it is important that we address this as quickly as possible. That's been reiterated. I just want to reiterate that along with all the people who have spoken previously. The time is now that we need to address the housing issue here in the community. I think that the affordable housing should be dispersed throughout our city. Another key element is to make sure that we are providing in the affordable definition for very low income people, making sure that there are protections for them. I think the city also should be obligated to provide a better safety net for those who become at risk. One other element that is important to me is to make sure, well, just make sure that we address this as soon as possible. Thanks.
Hi, Betsy Thaggart. Thanks for a great presentation. The main thing I took away from it is that the higher the densities we allow in our zoning, the more affordable units we're going to be able to build. And that's what we need, is the maximum of affordable units. So we've got to have the market rate, we've got to have the high densities, and that will get us so we have places that people can afford to live in. It will also leverage money for transportation improvements, and we need a safer Adeline Street. We're going to have all these people living on it. Safer for children, safer for seniors, safer for bicyclists, pedestrians. So please keep all that in mind too. Thank you.
Okay, again, Taj Payne, friend of Adeline and NAHB. And so my thought about density is around making the low income 25 to 50% smaller so you get more of it. And they can also pay for it. I thought it was a really good thing to do. Yeah.
My name is Jody Levin. I'm a South Berkeley resident. I'm also part of South Berkeley now. Thank you so much for the presentation. That was very edifying. I think this might be, I might be getting ahead of myself when we're talking about, once we start talking about design, but I think that, we're talking about a lot about money and units and use of land, and I think that there's a really important element, which is that people need to feel safe and inspired by where they're living. So density is great. We need density. We also need things like open space improvements, bike lanes, things like that. We want, even if it is 100% affordable housing, these people who live in affordable housing have the right to beautiful, safe spaces. So I just want to emphasize that. And yeah, thank you very much for your work.
Hi, good evening. My name is Jeffrey Spahn. I'm a fairly new resident of Berkeley. So we've only been living here a little over a year, almost years now, but I've been involved in the community for almost 20. So I moved here 20 years ago to teach multicultural education at UC Berkeley. So diversity and affordable housing, even affordable student housing, is a high priority of mine. This relates to another issue tonight, but there's about 10 of us here for item 12. One of the things that I would suggest as a solution to this project that you've been discussing is that you're going to need funding. You're going to need sources of additional funds from the city to do what I think all of our values are to do. That involves enforcement. So you need to currently enforce the existing laws that you already have. In my neighborhood alone, just to quantify this, we have a neighborhood council where we have a developer in our neighborhood where with about 5 continuous lots, that would equal approximately $3.2 million that you could use for these other projects. So I would encourage you to look at other sources of funding because all of these projects need to be successfully completed and you're going to need sources of funding for that.
Thank you. Yes, and that'll be relevant. I hope you'll come back and speak to item 12. Thank you. Any more public comment?
I got one for spending. We should have Google and Facebook and those guys to give money to the pot to build these for these properties. That's another good one. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, then I got notice from Adeline that we do have a little bit more time, but I know we don't want to go much past 10 because it's late and there's some people here waiting for other items. But we'll turn it back to the Planning Commission. Again, I think let's start with some questions that we have for Rick and give Rick a chance to answer our questions and also questions that the audience raised. And then we can have a little bit more discussion about all of this and kind of the direction of where this is going to go. And then we'll talk about setting up a subcommittee. So first, were there any clarifying questions for Rick about his presentation? Anything you wanted to add? All right, okay, we'll just go down the line. So Steve, Rob, and then Ella.
All right, my question is, what do you really envision, and in terms of feasibility also, by under the category of benefit? Because you start out talking about community benefits, but something which is of benefit to a community is not the same thing as benefits for a community.
Right.
That is, if you increase the density of buildings all over the community, you're going to change the community. And the question is that a benefit to the community or not? And that inequality between what benefits a community and something which is a benefit for a community has to be, it seems to me, clarified and re-envisioned.
Rob?
Yeah, several questions. One, the question of on-site units versus fees. Do you get with the fees that are charged now, what kind of, with $100,000 of city money, how much can you leverage from other sources, federal or state, et cetera? In other words, what's the assumption? Are you getting $3 for every more local or what is it? And also, how does it work out? Do you get as many units if somebody pays the fees on a project rather than dividing them outside? How far does that 37,000 the other question, this is close to what Teresa Clark raised, is how do you get housing for people at different levels? Because you have the density bonus is geared at 50% of AMI. A lot of federal money is geared at 50 or 60% of AMI. If you want housing for people at 30% of AMI, how do you do that? Does that mean you have to have a much deeper local contribution, a much deeper subsidy? How does does that work? And how do you get units for the people at 80%? People who qualify as on the outer edge of what qualifies as low income? Because our inclusionary thing now says 20% units, 10 very low, and 10 low. But as you pointed out, what people are doing is they're taking the density bonus by providing very low and then paying the rest in fees. And then those fees can't necessarily be used to get housing at 80%. So, right, so you don't have to answer this tonight, but I would like to at some point. And I also would like to know a little bit about not just construction costs, but land costs. They've been going way up, and is land value, how do we make land value capture work? Because I've heard some cases where the land is already paid for, and the developer comes to build, and therefore, how do you capture something that's already been paid?
My question is really similar to that. A big takeaway for me is that a lot of developers are opting for the housing mitigation fee over affordable units, so I'm wondering how you think that we can prioritize and streamline projects that opt for affordable units rather than a fee.
Okay, I have myself, and then Ben Beach, and then Brad, and then Mary Kay. Thank you, this was really great. A couple of questions that might be to Rick, or might go to Lisa or Eileen. One is, how do you think the opportunity zone designation in the corridor will affect that, those numbers? And does that give us more room to increase our affordability? Second, and again, this might be a separate conversation, but my understanding from what you were describing about the base project, I think that was so helpful to really break down where I see this fundamental disconnect where when projects want to use the state density bonus project, they get to use the lowest density in our zoning code to calculate the base project, basically what's permitted under the zoning certificate to calculate the base project. But then when they're calculating their bonus, they get to calculate their bonus based off of what a use permit would allow. And I'm wondering if we can just change administratively to state that the application of the state density bonus law in Berkeley means that we look that the base project has to align with the same project that they're applying the density bonus to. So namely, if they're using a use permit project as what they're using to calculate the bonus, and they have to use a use permit project as how they calculate the base. And I don't know if we can just make that an administrative reg change in our guidelines and how we apply the state density bonus law. And then my last question is, and Rick, this is maybe more back to you, it's really helpful to hear you talk about kind of what the market realities are, but I'm curious if we can talk more from the starting point to some of the earlier comments that were made, of what is the community's vision in terms of the depths of affordability, these lower levels, 30%, 60, 80, whatever, and then look at what are all of the tools in our toolbox to reach that vision, right? And kind of, as Ben Beach was talking about with the local preference policies, like, yeah, we can look at what currently exists, what the market conditions are, but we also know that not all housing is built based off of those markets that you were describing. That there's nonprofit developers, that there's land trusts, that there's co-ops, that there's other housing models that actually have really deep roots in this community. And what role does those models play in achieving our community goals and vision in terms of depth of affordability? And in that sense, I think that we would be looking at a land use framework that isn't so much about incentivizing, getting the private market developers, offering them incentives in order to increase affordability, but maybe more of a regulatory framework, right? Of saying, you know what, if you provide 100% affordable housing, then you get a whole bunch of goodies. If you are permanently affordable, if you are community owned, you get a whole bunch of goodies. But if you aren't those things, you don't get access to any of those. And if that might be a way, rather than trying to get the market rate developers to behave the way we want them to, instead to, I use gardening metaphors a lot, but like to use fertilizers so that only co-ops and land trusts and nonprofit housing developments will grow. Right. Okay.
presentation, and I really appreciate the incredible depth of thinking and the sort of art and science of eking out every last affordable unit from the private market. I do wonder, in a similar vein though, what exploration has been made of public land in the corridor, because it strikes me that opens up a lot more opportunities for what you said the community is looking for. So you mentioned the park sites, but I wonder about other strategies for public land.
Brett?
Good segue. Appreciate all the, sort of dashboard look at how this development business works. I look through these numbers all the time. And I think there's something I want you to think about, or as this plan goes forward, and I think of this term that the map is not always the territory. And, if you talk to a market rate developer and said, well, hey, you can earn 6% return if you just build half your project as affordable, most of them are not going to do that. Because the return you're talking about is sort of day one. And most people are looking at 7, 8, 10-year holds, and so they want unrestricted units. That's the reason affordable developers like us build affordable housing, because we want to keep it affordable long term, and market rate guys want to increase over time. So I think calibrate that a little, but I do appreciate the attempt to incentivize a mix of these things, and let the development community that's very creative find ways to meet these incentives, or to get these incentives. My simple question is, how much developable land is there in the plan area? Not the big parking lots, but everything else, because when this plan first started, I've been down at the park station looking at drawings, and I didn't see a whole lot of actual developable land without displacing folks. And I'm talking about land where you don't have to tear down a house to build. I'm talking, I don't know if that's the way you have it. The scale of that.
I wanted to ask also, I guess this is a little bit of a theme here, about, I wanted to have a better understanding of how the analysis you did would work if we were really focusing on nonprofit developers. And as Chris was mentioning, other ways that the community has been interested in looking at housing, like land trusts and co-ops. This would be good, I think, to really explore that more, so we got an understanding, and we could compare the analysis you did to what alternatives might be. And then I just had a very specific question that you don't have to answer tonight, but I know that parking is a very large component. You mentioned that. And there's a lot of talk about parking not being as necessary at transit-oriented housing. So I was curious, you mentioned that that the developers are going to want to have parking and the tenants are going to want to have parking. And I just like to get a sense of what that need is, or where that comes from. Who are the tenants that want it? I have a sense of who they are, but I'd really like to hear from you who it is that's demanding that parking.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay. Are there any other questions for Rick? I don't know if you've got enough. Okay. So we'll let you respond both to the questions that came up on the commission, and also questions that were asked in the audience.
How much time do we have left?
So we'll keep going. I said that this was going to end in a few minutes, but we'll keep going. We'll go another 10, 15 minutes until it takes you to answer the question, and then I think our discussion of what to do next step as a planning commission will actually lead into the next item, which is about the subcommittee. So
okay, I'll try to be quick and answer just the questions where there's kind of a concrete answer. There's a lot of questions there. So someone asked if we put San Francisco on the chart, what the community benefits requirements would be, and they would be higher. They're definitely higher in San Francisco, and I don't know the number off the top of my head. It's a great question. Someone also mentioned that developers don't want to administer affordable units, and I think that that's absolutely true. And yet, our track record across the country is when it's just a little bit more financially beneficial, they figure out how to do it. I don't think that means that they want to do 50%, but I do think that the development community in the Bay Area has learned how to handle affordable units in their projects, and there's not as much resistance here as we see in other parts of the country. And if the financing can work and the economics work, some of them will prefer to do the affordable units on site, and that's what they do in places where that's the thing that works best. But they're always going to rather pay a fee if it's totally up to them. It is a big burden on them.
Kick the fee up.
So that there's a question about concentrating affordable housing at the BART versus spreading it throughout the neighborhood, and there's a question that several people raised, and then Ben raised again about the other sites. So the draft plan identifies a number of publicly owned sites that may be appropriate for affordable housing, and for each and every one of them, there's a set of questions that you would have to answer before you said whether it actually is. But there are enough of them that it's very encouraging to think that there would be more than just these two sites, and that there would be other projects. The other sites are smaller, and so they're going to be a little bit more complicated. But I think there is land in the neighborhood, and there's room for development. The other thing, I don't have the number on the top of my head. I'm jumping around, but I don't have the number on the top of my head, so I won't quote it right now. But the plan had to do projections for how much building would happen in order to do an EIR. And so the EIR will come back, and you will see what at least for the EIR, what the projection is about how much developable opportunity there is. But the question about concentrating the affordable units at the BART site is really a question that's, it's like it's above my pay grade. It's your job to think about. If you could get a lot of other sites, you could spread the affordable housing around, and I think that that's generally what people want. And several people commented on, well, we want it to be all throughout the whole city, not just in this neighborhood. And that's advice that I give to other cities all the time. You want it everywhere. And I think when we thought about what was feasible here, we definitely considered that there would need to also be we couldn't use all of the city's affordable housing money in this one neighborhood, right? You can't just put it all here. But the choice still remains for here is, do you prefer to have more than your share? Because if you're concerned about displacement, one way to respond is to say, because this neighborhood is a high, it's accessible to transit, it's central, it's in high demand, we need to do what we can now to preserve this community, and so we need to take more affordable, not all, but more affordable units here. I'm not arguing for that, I'm just saying that's the strategy that we've built into this plan. So think about whether that's actually the right strategy for your neighborhood, because it's not my neighborhood. Can you make the low-income units smaller? Yeah. Then you're not going to have families in them necessarily. Sometimes people want to make them larger, and I think that the reason we're not going to provide an incredibly detailed blueprint to what's going to go on this site is that what you really want is a nonprofit developer, land trusted co-op, whoever, who's trying to maximize the community benefit to do the detailed planning and to say, here's where there's demand, here's the unit sizes, here's what people need in terms of services, etc., and not have it be some cookie cutter thing. But yeah, you can move that. You can get more units if they're smaller, and you can get fewer units if they're larger. Okay, so another question that came up a lot is, how do we serve people at or below 30% of AMI? This is not something where there's a single answer, and I'm going to give an answer, and prove me wrong, please. I'd love to be wrong about this, but here's how I think it works. Above 30% of median income, we need what we call capital subsidy. We need money up front once to lower the cost of building the building. And then the resident pays rent every month that covers the operating cost for the building. And as we get further down the income ladder, that rent, isn't enough to cover a mortgage, but it covers the operating costs. Below about 30% of AMI, the rent doesn't cover the operating costs. And so those projects, in addition to very large capital subsidies, also get annual operating subsidies. Someone has to agree to write a check every single year, not just one time to build the building. And so that puts you in a whole other category. And unfortunately, that's true if you're a land trust, it's true if you're a co-op, it's true if you're a communist, it's true if you're a socialist, it's just true. In order to serve, you don't need, the problem there is not profit. The problem is you have to pay someone to manage the property and to do maintenance and to pay taxes and all of that. And so to serve people at the lowest income, the way we do it is we have some kind of rental assistance that gets paired with a subsidy, a one-time subsidy to build the building. And that's the thing. So several people said, well, yeah, but what do we do if Berkeley doesn't have more Section 8, right? That's the challenge. So I think my hunch, and again, you guys are going to work on this, but my hunch is the way that you get more total units at a deeper affordability level is to look citywide at where your housing money is going and how you're allocating it. And there are several cities that have done local voucher programs. It's not something you couldn't do, but I haven't seen it for a single neighborhood, no. But it could be done. But I'm saying, I think if you look citywide at the supply of vouchers, essentially, that's the key to getting down below 30. And so that's a money thing, and it is. Someone said, is it more of the city's money to do 30% relative to the others? Right now, the way it generally works, not necessarily, because there's state programs and there's other programs, but those programs are limited to what they're limited to, and until Washington steps up. Really, Washington is the answer to that problem, right? Yeah. But until Washington steps up to the plate, until the federal government expands Section 8, we're really limited in how many of those units get built. Interestingly though, serving people at 80% is more expensive than serving people at 40 or 50%. And the reason is the low-income housing tax credit. So the question was, how much is the leverage? I'm sorry I don't know the number off the top of my head. I did an analysis for Oakland, and it was like 4 to 1. So your number's probably different than that, but for every $1 of local money, there's $4 of somebody else's money. It might be 3, it might be 5, but it's something in that order of magnitude. So it's a lot. But as soon as you go above 60% of median, you're not eligible for the low-income housing tax credit anymore. So if you want to subsidize a unit at 80%, even though that person needs less subsidy, Berkeley gives up the federal subsidy, and you have to carry that all on your own. And that's why you don't do that much of that. You could, but it costs you more. That's to Teresa's point about with inclusionary units, you get those 80% units, and you don't have that same dynamic. So a lot of cities have consciously pursued the strategy of, we want the sort of more middle or low units to be the ones in the mixed income inclusionary buildings, and then we want to use our subsidy to get further down. There's a logic to that. There was a question about the leverage and which is better, fees or units. I haven't studied this in detail here. I did a comprehensive study in Seattle, and my impression of the economics here is that it's quite similar. But the numbers I'm going to quote you are Seattle. The first question is, which is better for the developer, paying the fee or providing the units? And actually, I know this about Berkeley. In Berkeley, it's generally a little bit cheaper to pay the fee than to build the units. Right? So that's why they pay the fee. But it's not dramatically cheaper. We did a statewide housing study. We found lots of parts of the state where the fee was way lower. The fee is comparable. It's the same order of magnitude cost. And so that's why the state density bonus is enough to sort of make it worth their while. So they can make it work because they would have to pay the fee anyway. And if you remember the dial that I showed about how it doesn't matter that much, whether we do 0 or 40%, the reason that dial doesn't change that much is because your fee is actually there no matter what. So if they do 0, they have to pay the fee, right? So there's not that much incentive to pay the fee. If they do 20, they don't have to pay the fee. So that fee is comparable to what it costs to do units on site. But that's just the first question. The second question is, when you get the fee, is it worth more than 1 unit? So what I found in Seattle was that for each unit they gave up on site, they built 3 units off site. Because of that 4-to-1 federal money leverage. The fee money came in, they would have had, in Seattle they would have built units at 80% of median on site. They got the money in, they went and they spent it, they gave it to a nonprofit, the nonprofit levered it up with a whole bunch of other money, and they got 4 units for everyone that, yeah?
But, I mean, do they have the same amount of developable land for nonprofits in Seattle that we do here? And 2, over what period of time, what period of time did that take?
Took them 4.5 years. So they spent the money 4.5 years after they would have gotten an on-site unit. So that's the downside. The upside was they served people at 40% of median instead of 80. So I think that the answer here is not necessarily the same, and it is totally about land supply. You've been spending the fees that you collect. You're getting some leverage that you probably have more units that get produced when you collect the fees. But when you think about this neighborhood, it would be difficult to assume that those fees were going to get spent here. They could. You could take all the fees from the private projects and put them all on the BART sites and the other public sites, and that would help. But it's a little bit, it seems too much to assume that. So that's why we didn't do that. So I think that's the argument for trying to get more on-site units. I think you can get, so someone asked, how could you get more on-site units? I think you can get more on-site units, but the strategy that we're proposing here is by offering more density and using that density as a carrot. The state bonus is working the way the state intended it to work. People are choosing to provide the minimum number that they need to get the maximum bonus, and what we've proposed in this draft is just to extend that forward to higher numbers. And I think it's likely that they'll continue to move up that ladder. I don't, however, think that means they're going to go to 50%. I don't know where they'll stop, but just because we have 50% in that chart doesn't mean that the typical developer is going to build 50% affordable housing. The idea is to let them choose, but to incentivize them to move up that ladder. Last thing I wanted to say, I think I hit most of the questions. I'll look through and make sure I didn't miss any, but there was also a set of questions about, couldn't we go more? Couldn't we build, couldn't we even, if we had more density, couldn't we get more affordable housing? And again, that's over my pay grade. That's the right question. Yes, you could, if you offered more than 100% bonus density, you could get more affordable housing. Either they'd be more likely to do it, or you could require a higher percentage. I don't think it's practical to imagine projects that are mostly affordable housing and just a little bit market rate housing, because just no one's going to want to do it. But what we're talking about is actually, it's not really outside of the realm of possibility. And several cities have done density bonuses that only apply to 100% affordable projects. So you could say, if it's an 100% affordable project, we're going to go even that much higher, right? It doesn't have to be a mixed income project to use the bonus. Let me just look through and see if I missed any other important ones. Someone asked about what's happening to land cost. We do not know. There's not good data on that. It's very anecdotal. It's very hard to tell. And it's volatile, I think, is the feedback we get. That it's very hard for property owners to predict what they're going to get for their land right now. Opportunity zones, yeah, it could be. I think we still don't know what the economic impact. So this is like a new tax benefit that should encourage investors to want to put capital here. The problem that we have is that they don't need the community's permission to get that tax credit. So it's very hard to direct it to the kind of thing you want. But it very well may be, there's a scenario where the whole housing market collapses except for the opportunity zones, because the yields just don't work except when you layer in opportunity zones. So there could be a period of time, and it'll just be a brief period of time, where there's a lot of pressure on opportunity zones because it's the only place they can make their returns. Odds are that won't last for very long. Another question was just like, well, are we stuck with this reality? Can we change the reality? The reality will change on its own, whether we want it to or not. The market will at some point correct. All the economics we're doing now will be very different 5 years from now and very different 10 years from now. So all we're trying to do with this is to just get a sense of how much these different decisions make. When you know, if the plan is adopted the way it's written and then it's turned into zoning, the actual projects that will be subject to it will have very different economics than this. They could be way worse. They could be way better. You're going to need to have an ongoing process of monitoring the market. What have I forgotten? Parking. Parking is like the thing that developers spend all their time talking about these days, because it used to be that cities required them to build empty parking lots, and so they didn't have to think about it. They just did it, and they kind of complained about it. That sometimes, particularly around here, it was like they knew they were being forced to build parking they weren't going to use. And now the tables have turned, and it's really the developers and their investors and the tenants that are driving how much parking is getting built, particularly in these transit-oriented locations. There are some places where we're seeing successful projects with no parking. Downtown Berkeley is one of them. But we're not seeing that at BART stations everywhere by a long shot. But it's also changing really fast. So it really could be that 5 years from now, that is the reality. But in my opinion, from having talked to a lot of developers, is that it's too soon to start assuming that that's the world. It could be, I hope it is. I hope that's the world we're moving into. And you would think Ashby Park would be next in line to be a place where people would consider living and not having a parking space. But my hunch is, if you're building today and you're a developer, you're going to hedge your bets and you're going to build some parking, or else it's going to be really hard to lease up the property. I don't know who the tenants are exactly, but it's really still a wide. It's the people with cars, you know. And at 0.5, it's only some of the people with cars and some of the people without cars.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit about whether your scope includes looking beyond what you presented here? So like the example of 100% affordable land trust co-ops, other things that don't necessarily need that incentive matrix?
Yeah. The answer is yes. There are elements in the draft plan already that address land trusts and co-ops, and the whole what do we do with the public land is essentially it's if we maximize the use of public land for affordable housing, that's not the same return numbers. Those return numbers are really just the mixed use projects.
Right.
I spent a lot of time working with co-ops and then with land trusts. I don't think that the fundamental economics are different for those tenure types than they are for RCD or Zaha. What they can serve with a certain amount of subsidy is the same as what the land trust can serve, whether it's ownership or rent. You know, it matters what the product type is. The accountability to the community is really different. The accountability to residents is really different. But the core, like how much subsidy do you need per unit, is not noticeably different.